You've got 72 hours to remove that thing, or we'll start fining you daily, Olivia Bradford snapped, pointing at the small cedar doghouse I built in my backyard for Max, my golden retriever. I blinked at her, then looked at Max, who was lying peacefully on the grass next to the doghouse, head tilted as if he, too, couldn't believe what he was hearing. You serious? I asked. Olivia folded her arms. She had the signature HOA Karen look. Oversized sunglasses, pastel cardigan tied around her shoulders, and the posture of someone who thinks she owns the sky. Dead serious. That structure violates Article 14, Section 3 of the HOA's architectural regulations. Unauthorized external pet dwellings are strictly prohibited. I held up my hands. It's a doghouse, not a gazebo. It's 3 feet wide. Doesn't matter, she sniffed. You didn't get it approved and now you'll need to submit a removal verification form. Or pay $100 a day until it's gone. I stared at her like she'd just asked me to demolish my garage. You're fining me for something in my backyard? Our backyard, she corrected smugly. You agreed to HOA terms when you bought in. This neighborhood has standards. I bit back the urge to laugh. Right? Standards. Now here's where things get interesting. See, what Olivia didn't know was that I, Noah Langston, owned the small strip of land that the HOA office sat on. I bought it 2 years ago, right after the previous owner, an old friend, moved to Florida and offered it to me cheap. Turns out, when the original developers drew up the neighborhood plans, they leased that parcel for 99 years but never actually purchased it. I had the title. It was mine. I hadn't planned to do anything with it. The HOA building was tiny, just a prefab office with outdated siding and a dying ficus by the door. But if they were coming after Max's doghouse, that changed everything. Fine, I said calmly to Olivia. I'll take care of it. She gave me a curt nod and strutted off like she'd just won a war. I watched her go, already planning my move. That night, I pulled out the deed, checked the lot number, and smiled. Time to send the HOA a little reminder. The next morning, I hand-delivered a letter to the HOA mailbox. It was short and sweet. Effective immediately, the lease agreement for Lot 48A, HOA office grounds, is terminated. Monthly occupancy fees are now doubled. See enclosed invoice. I even attached a copy of the original land deed, with my name right there in bold letters. By noon, Olivia was back at my door, fuming. Is this some kind of joke? She asked, waving the letter like it was radioactive. Nope, I said, sipping my coffee. The land your office sits on? Mine. You've been paying me a small fee through the old lease. That lease is now canceled. New rate starts today. You can't do that, she shrieked. Sure I can. You're on private property. My private property. Unless you want to relocate your HOA office, you'll need to pay the new rate. Her face turned the color of microwaved beets. This is extortion. No, Olivia, it's real estate. I gave her a nod. Oh, and Max's doghouse stays. Permanently. She stormed off without another word. I shut the door and turned to Max. Well, buddy, I said, I think we just became the HOA's worst nightmare. The following morning, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No postage, no return address, just my name in stiff block letters. Inside was a cease and desist letter, typed in all caps, legalese so sloppy it could have been written by someone who got their law degree on a cereal box. It accused me of fraudulent land claims and illegally interfering with HOA operations, and it concluded with a laughable ultimatum: rescind my new lease terms immediately or face legal escalation. I read it once, then again, just to appreciate the sheer confidence it took to threaten a landowner while trespassing on their land. After feeding Max and grabbing a second cup of coffee, I called my lawyer, Cheryl. She'd helped me with the land purchase 2 years back and had a memory sharp enough to recite municipal codes from memory. When I explained the letter, she laughed so hard she had to put me on hold to catch her breath. Let them try, she said when she came back. There's no fraud. You have the deed, the county registry backs it up, and their old lease was legally terminated. You're not just within your rights, you're practically gift wrapping them a warning. I thanked her and asked her to draft a formal response with a reminder that continued use of my land required payment under the new fee structure and that any retaliatory action could be legally interpreted as harassment. By noon that day, the HOA's website went down. An hour after that, their Facebook page disappeared. A neighbor named Grant, a retired telecom technician who spent more time in his garage tinkering with old radios than anyone should, dropped by with a grin. Olivia tried to hold an emergency Zoom meeting this morning, he said. Only problem was she didn't realize the Wi-Fi router for their office is plugged into the utility box on your land. Once she saw your name on the title, she yanked the whole thing offline out of spite. I leaned on the fence. She's willing to cripple her own operations just to avoid acknowledging reality? Grant chuckled. That woman would set her own shoes on fire if you told her they were on your lawn. That evening, I walked Max around the block. The usual wave from neighbors now came with nods of respect. Some even offered quiet words of support. Apparently, word had spread faster than Olivia could spin it. Most folks had suffered under her regime for years. Surprise fines for mailbox flags being the wrong color, threats over lawn ornament placement, even someone getting a citation for having a visually disruptive doormat. That one had a pineapple on it. Back at home, I started compiling documentation. Every legal record, email thread, lease termination letter, and parcel map. I wanted it all ready. I had a hunch Olivia wasn't going to back down quietly. 2 days later, that hunch proved right. A city code enforcement officer showed up at my door, clipboard in hand. His name was Officer Darnell, and he looked exhausted before he even spoke. Sorry to bother you, he said, but we got a complaint about an unlicensed structure on your property. The Doghouse? I asked. He nodded. Technically, yes. But I've already taken a look. It's well under the size threshold, no utilities connected, and doesn't violate any zoning regulations. Honestly, I wouldn't be here if someone hadn't filed 15 separate reports in the last 24 hours. 15? I raised an eyebrow. He sighed. Same person, different aliases. All traced back to a single IP which we're fairly certain belongs to the HOA office. I just wanted to swing by personally and let you know I'm closing the case. Before he left, I asked if he could forward me the incident reports. He nodded and said they'd be available through the city's public records portal within 48 hours. That was all I needed. I spent the next evening printing out every report, every complaint, and every copy of correspondence I'd had with the HOA since moving in. Then I filed a formal complaint with the city attorney's office, citing harassment, misuse of public resources, and abuse of administrative systems. But I wasn't done. The next step was the county tax assessor's office. I requested a full audit of the HOA's financial filings. Since they were incorporated as a nonprofit neighborhood association, they were legally required to file annual spending reports. And here's where things got truly interesting. The last 3 years showed consistent payments made to land lease expenses, but the amounts didn't match what I'd been paid. In fact, they were almost double. I called Cheryl again. Someone's cooking books, she said. And if they've been inflating lease payments on paper, it's likely they've been funneling HOA dues elsewhere. That's embezzlement. Noah. She offered to refer me to a forensic accountant, but I already had someone better in mind, my cousin Jenna, who worked as an auditor for the state's Department of Financial Regulation. I gave her a call that night and explained what I'd found. She didn't even hesitate. Send me everything. 3 days passed with no word from Olivia. Then, as I was pulling into my driveway on a rainy Thursday, I noticed a moving van parked outside the HOA office. 2 people were loading boxes into the back, while a third man, mid-50s, wearing a windbreaker with the county seal, stood nearby watching. I approached cautiously. You know a Langston? The man asked. I nodded. Detective Carroll. Fraud and Public Corruption Division. You're not in trouble, but would you be willing to answer a few questions about the HOA's financial practices? He showed me his badge and I agreed. We stood under my porch roof while I filled him in on everything: land ownership, lease changes, the discrepancy in payments. We've got probable cause to believe HOA leadership has been submitting false expenditure reports and pocketing the difference, he said. City funds were never involved, but it's still a felony if proven. Someone's been siphoning HOA dues into a slush fund for personal use. Vacations, spa days, high-end furniture. All traceable. As he talked, Olivia exited the office building, umbrella in one hand, a leather-bound binder in the other. Her face went pale when she saw me standing with the detective. She tried to walk past us without a word. "Ma'am," Carol said, stepping in front of her. "We need you to remain on site. A warrant's being executed. Please don't interfere." Olivia's lips tightened, but she said nothing. For once, not a single condescending word passed her mouth. That night, I got a call from Jenna. "You cracked it wide open," she said. "They've been padding the land lease category for years, then using the surplus for off-the-books perks. Spa memberships, Amazon purchases, even private catering for board meetings. Olivia's name is on almost every receipt. How much are we talking? Close to $50,000 annually. Over 3 years, that's a felony and a half." The next morning, a notice went up at the community bulletin board near the park entrance. It was stamped with the county seal, "Pending investigation, all HOA operations temporarily suspended." Beneath it, a message from the interim board elected in emergency session invited residents to an open forum to discuss future governance. No more closed-door policies. No more secret fines. At the forum, I sat near the back, Max curled at my feet. A woman named Daria, who'd been cited last year for overly fragrant gardenias, stood at the podium and looked out over the crowd. "We owe a debt of thanks," she said, "to the neighbor who stood his ground, read the fine print, and reminded this HOA that power doesn't mean impunity." People applauded. Some even stood. I didn't say a word. I just gave Max a gentle pat and watched as the neighborhood finally started to rebuild, not around rules, but around trust. The neighborhood was changing. With the HOA suspended, the fear that had once hung over every mailbox and yard flag lifted like morning fog. People began repainting their shutters, planting what they actually liked, and chatting freely on sidewalks again. As if Olivia's name had been some kind of curse, they were finally allowed to stop whispering. The interim board, composed of 3 longtime residents voted in during the emergency meeting, announced they'd be hosting a full audit with third-party oversight. They also opened the books to any homeowner who wanted to look. That transparency alone felt revolutionary. But things hadn't settled. Not yet. Late one evening, I sat at my desk going over some paperwork when I noticed headlights sweeping across my living room wall. It was past 11. Too late for visitors. I glanced out the front window and watched a dark sedan roll slowly past my house, pause at the end of the driveway, then keep going. I stepped outside with Max at my side. The air was cool, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every rustle. I didn't recognize the car, but I made a mental note of the plate. Probably nothing, just someone lost on the way to the next street over, but something about the way it lingered didn't sit right. The next morning, I installed a motion-activated floodlight over the garage. Then I mounted a second camera beneath the eaves, angled toward the street. I wasn't paranoid, just prepared. Later that week, I got a call from Detective Carroll. "We recovered several external hard drives from the HOA office," he said. "Encrypted, but we're working through them." "What are you expecting to find?" I asked. "There's been chatter about off-the-record transactions. Bigger ones than what we originally documented. We're trying to determine if someone was laundering HOA funds through dummy vendors." "You're saying it wasn't just Olivia?" "We think she was the face. Someone else might have been steering things from behind the scenes." That stopped me cold. I'd assumed Olivia was the queen bee. Overbearing, petty, obsessed with control, sure. But laundering? Someone else pulling strings? That hadn't occurred to me. "Any suspects?" He hesitated. "We're not ready to name names. But if you notice anything unusual, visits, calls, anything, keep a record. We'll connect the dots." I agreed and hung up, now very aware of the 2-inch thick folder of HOA documents sitting on my desk. That night, I flipped through it again, looking for anything I'd missed. In the original lease documents, I'd found a name I hadn't noticed before. Thomas Elridge. He'd signed as operations consultant on one of the HOA's land use addendums, though he never appeared in any of the board minutes. No email address, no contact number, just a signature. I ran the name through the county's business license directory. Nothing. Then I tried the state's contractor registry. Still nothing. But when I checked the public procurement database, I hit something. A company called Redwood Advisory Services had filed multiple service invoices with local municipalities in years past, all under the name Thomas Elridge. Only thing was, Redwood had been dissolved 5 years ago. So why was he still listed on a recent HOA document? I called Cheryl and gave her the summary. "That's not just shady, Noah," she said. "That's potentially criminal." If he was invoicing under a dissolved entity and the HOA paid those invoices, that could be fraud or even wire fraud if digital payments were involved. Can you pull the payment records? Already on it. I'll also cross-reference that name with any flagged vendors from the state's internal fraud watch list. By Friday, she had results. Redwood Advisory Services received 3 wire transfers from the HOA account. 2 years ago, then again last year, totaling close to $70,000. I froze. None of that ever appeared on the HOA's expenditure reports. Exactly. Which means it was either paid under a false category or off the books entirely. I relayed everything to Detective Carroll. He asked me to send over the files, then warned me to stay alert. If someone's been hiding that kind of money, they're not going to let it go quietly. That weekend, someone broke into the HOA office. It happened around 3 in the morning. My floodlight camera caught a figure in a dark hoodie approaching the back door. They jimmied the lock, slipped inside, and reappeared 12 minutes later carrying a box. They left in the same sedan I'd seen earlier. I sent the footage to Carol. By Monday, that box was found dumped behind the old tennis courts. It was mostly empty, but inside was a destroyed laptop, its hard drive smashed. There were fragments of burned paper, bits of ledger columns, and one partially intact receipt. At the bottom of the box was a USB drive overlooked by whoever had torched the rest. Carol had the drive analyzed. It contained spreadsheets, raw, unformatted, but they told a clear story. Monthly transfers to an account in Arizona, all labeled vaguely as consulting retainer. The account holder? A Thomas Elridge. The bank was flagged for potential financial crimes. Carol coordinated with federal investigators. The moment interstate wire transfers came into play, it became a whole new level of investigation. While the feds did their thing, I was called to testify before a grand jury. They wanted to know about the land ownership, the lease, Olivia's conduct, and how I'd uncovered the discrepancies. I answered everything under oath, watching as the assistant district attorney scribbled notes with increasing intensity. 2 weeks later, a warrant was issued for Thomas Elridge. Turns out he'd been running a shell game across multiple HOAs for years. He'd infiltrate the board by convincing overworked volunteers to outsource operations to professionals. Then he'd quietly siphon money through inflated consulting fees, kickbacks, and fake infrastructure charges. Olivia had been his inside woman, willfully blind but complicit. She'd received luxury perks in exchange for silence and a rubber stamp on whatever he handed her. She was arrested for felony fraud and conspiracy to embezzle. Elridge was picked up trying to board a flight to Belize. The fallout was swift. The state attorney general launched a task force to audit every HOA Elridge had interacted with. At least 6 others were found to have similar discrepancies. Some had lost hundreds of thousands. Back in our neighborhood, the interim board voted unanimously to dissolve the old HOA charter and replace it with a new residence council. No officers, no president, just elected committees with limited authority and full transparency. One of the first measures passed? A clause protecting private backyard structures under reasonable use unless they posed a safety risk. Max's Doghouse became the poster child for that clause. They even used a photo of him lounging on the porch for the neighborhood newsletter. A month later, I received a thank you note not from the board, but from a group of residents who'd quietly organized a legal defense fund in case Olivia had retaliated against anyone else. They handed me a plaque at the next community gathering for service in defense of common sense and golden retrievers. I hung it in my garage. Max didn't care, of course. He just wanted his usual afternoon treat. But as I watched him trot across the yard, tail high, I realized something bigger had changed. The neighborhood had found its voice again. Not through meetings or motions, but through people finally realizing they didn't have to tolerate being pushed around by people who built their power on silence and fear. All it took was one doghouse, one deed, and one person who decided enough was enough. The first community-wide meeting under the newly formed Residents' Council was held outdoors, under the shade of the large sycamores behind the old tennis courts. Folding chairs, lemonade coolers, and a low hum of cautious optimism filled the air. No one wore polos with embroidered board titles anymore. No one clutched clipboards. Instead, neighbors brought their kids, their dogs, and for the first time in years, their full attention. I sat in the back again, not out of modesty, but because I'd gotten used to watching from the edges. Max lay beside me, his tail thumping every time someone walked by and gave him a scratch behind the ears. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting moving shadows across the gathering. A man I hadn't seen before stepped to the makeshift podium. He was in his late 40s, with sleeves rolled up and a worn leather notebook tucked under one arm. His voice carried easily. "My name's Curtis Bennett," he said. "I've lived here for 7 years, but I never spoke at a meeting before. Didn't feel like it mattered." Several people nodded. "Well, it matters now," Curtis continued. "Because someone finally refused to play along. Someone showed us that we don't have to be bullied in our own homes. And I think it's time we made sure this kind of thing never happens again." Curtis proposed a community oversight committee not to replace governance, but to monitor it. An independent, rotating group of volunteers who would audit every council decision, every expenditure, and every contract. No more unchecked power. No more closed books. The motion passed unanimously. Later that evening, while most neighbors lingered chatting and helping fold chairs, Cheryl called. I stepped away from the group to answer. "We got confirmation from the prosecutor's office," she said. "Elridge pled guilty. He cut a deal to avoid a full trial, but they're seizing his assets and freezing his accounts. He's looking at a minimum of 12 years. And Olivia? She's refusing to negotiate. Her attorney tried to argue she was manipulated, but the financial records are airtight. There's a paper trail of her signing off on every fraudulent transfer. She's going to trial. The DA wants to make an example of her." I leaned against the fence, watching Max nose around a patch of grass. "Anything else?" There was a pause. "There's one more thing." During the investigation, they uncovered a second set of vendor contracts. One's Olivia signed without board approval. One of them was a landscaping deal with a shell company, Greenview Solutions. Guess who owns it? I didn't answer. Elridge. He was charging for services never rendered. The phantom maintenance fees were buried in HOA dues, and Olivia approved them monthly. That's another 50 grand over 2 years. That made 4 separate channels of embezzled funds. Will homeowners get any of it back? I asked. Some. The DA's office is working with a restitution attorney. Assets seized from Elridge's properties will go toward partial repayments. It won't be everything, but it's something. After I hung up, I returned to find a group of kids playing tag across the now we'd speckled tennis court. No one was shouting at them to stop. No one was writing down license plates. For the first time in years, it felt like a neighborhood again. 2 weeks later, I was asked to testify at Olivia's arraignment. The courtroom was cool and impersonal, all marble and fluorescent lighting. Olivia sat at the defendant's table in a stiff gray suit, her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. She didn't look at me once. The prosecutor began by laying out the scope of the financial misconduct, but what struck me most was how calculated it all had been. Olivia hadn't just turned a blind eye, she'd orchestrated parts of the scheme. She'd used her position to silence dissenters, block inquiries, and intimidate homeowners who questioned the math. One document showed she even forged a vote result to approve a contract the real vote had failed. When I took the stand, the prosecutor asked me to recount how the situation had begun. I kept it simple. A letter, I said. She threatened fines over a doghouse I built for my retriever. That's how it started. And what did that lead to? I glanced at the judge, then back at the prosecutor. It led to unraveling 3 years of fraud, 4 shell companies, and a corrupt consultant trying to siphon money from innocent homeowners. Olivia's lawyer objected, but the objection was overruled. After testifying, I walked out of the courthouse into the heavy afternoon heat. Outside, a reporter tried to ask me for a statement, but I shook my head. The story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the dozens of residents who had stood up in their own ways by voting, by speaking out, by refusing to keep quiet. The trial lasted 5 days. On the 6th, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. Olivia was sentenced to 10 years with no possibility of parole for at least 6. The judge described her as a cautionary tale of community leadership turned tyrannical by unchecked authority. The following month, the old HOA office, a prefab box that had become a symbol of control, was officially closed. The building was dismantled and donated to a local animal shelter, who turned it into a volunteer check-in station. I visited once just to see it. The ficus was gone, but the doorbell still rang with the same dull chime. With the land back under my full control, I decided to turn it into something useful. Not a monument, not a reminder, just something quiet and good. I cleared the lot, leveled the ground, and built a small, open-air reading pavilion with benches, solar lanterns, and a locked community library box. Neighbors donated books. Someone painted a mural on the back wall, a golden retriever lounging under a tree. A tribute, they said, to how it all started. I never put a plaque on the pavilion. It didn't need it. Max and I walked past it most evenings. He always paused to sniff the base of the bench, tail wagging like he expected to find something new every time. One night, as we walked back home, a teenager on a skateboard coasted by and gave me a nod. "You're the guy with the doghouse thing, right?" I laughed. "That's me." He grinned. "Cool." He rolled on, and I stood there for a moment, watching the last of the sunset bleed out across the houses. No more fines. No more threats. Just neighbors figuring out how to be neighbors again. Back at our place, Max curled up in his cedar doghouse and let out a long, satisfied sigh. I sat beside him on the grass, looking up at the stars. The house down the street had gardenias blooming again. No one had told them to stop,